Hello, today we have with us RIC's Global Chief Executive, Mr. Sean Tompkins, and we have President-elect of RIC, Mr. Chris Brook. RIC is a global professional body promoting and enforcing the highest international standard in the valuation, management, and development of land, real estate, construction, and infrastructure. Mr. Sean, I'd like to start and ask you the first. With such a diverse range of business, the real estate, construction, what is your underlying value? What is your core competency you talk about?
I think two things. Firstly, professionalism and ethics. I mean, critical to any successful real estate and built environment is the underlying professional and ethics within the sector. And secondly, the importance of having standards that are consistent, applied across the board, and are regulated and monitored. So for our ICS, for 150 years, that's what we've been doing. We've been developing competent professionals who behave ethically, bringing in and introducing high standards and ensuring they get enforced.
Your benchmark, you said, is highest, in terms of, setting standard, and it's for different market, of course, around the world. When it comes to India, especially in the real estate market, it's still, evolving.
Yeah.
We have a new regulation, RERA, which of course being implemented. Keeping all those things in your mind, how do you see Indian market, and what are the challenges you see here at this stage?
It's changing. I mean, I've been coming to India now for over 8 years, and for the first 6 years, everyone was telling me how important it was to deal with standards, regulation, corruption in the real estate and construction industry. In the last 2 years, clearly there is a drive to change things, and we are seeing that. So, the introduction of RERA, the introduction of GST, I mean, all of these things are starting to transform the market. I think the biggest thing that we're just about to see in terms of transformation is the introduction of REIT. And I think when any country has introduced real estate investment trusts, REITs, that you start to see a transformation of the industry, because you need greater investable asset, so the product, the asset management of that product and its maintenance of growth is really important, but you also need very high standards of valuation, because the REIT environment will rely on the quality of valuation. That for me starts to change an industry.
Your clients are both perhaps government and the private sector, basically, who like to imbibe your practices, or how challenging for you to convince them and sort of accept your practices and follow and show them the efficiency and sort of profit out of that. How you feel the challenges, particularly in this situation?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think for us, we've been working at this now for a while. So in terms of valuation, I'm delighted that, as part of the new regulation of valuation in India, there's an agreement to work to international valuation standards. So that's a fantastic beginning. We are, as an organisation, going to play a role in the regulation of valuers. So we will set ourselves up as an RVO. Under the Indian regulations and guidance. Therefore, we are seeing a welcoming move to international standards and consistency, and we'd want to support that. So certainly that's at a sort of governmental level. Also at a governmental level, we're very focused on education. Through the work that we've done at the Amity University with the RICS School of the Built Environment, we're putting in a major education program to build the professionals of the future. But the marketplace, the people in the marketplace are very keen as well to see greater consistency across India, and therefore are embracing those standards. So, both at a government level and a market level, we're seeing change, and I can absolutely guarantee that over the last 2 years, I've felt that change. And I know the industry is responding to that in many, many different ways, but I think it will come out with a much more consistent, much more probably consolidated industry working to higher standards and professionalism.
Yeah, and then just maybe I could just add on the value piece. Obviously, I'm a practitioner as well, so I think what we see is those people that use the services of chartered surveyors, when they see that they have an RICS qualification, it's about trust, confidence. They know that the people that have got those qualifications are operating within a certain regulatory regime, driving certain standards. So from a user point of view, the value really is around that confidence, trust, and the ability to know that when they get advice from those chartered surveyors, it's being done within that framework and they're going to get the highest standard of advice. Yeah.
So RIC's involvement basically, is also at the policy level, It's at national level of various countries, which get involved right from the top. When you see from that perspective over the top, the policies and regulations, when it comes to India, do you think we have a sufficient policies at the moment or regulation at the moment which can drive the growth in the real estate construction market with the kind of benchmark you think should be? What's your comment?
First,
yeah, no, I think clearly over the last few years, as Sean mentioned, the regulatory regime has been moving forward quickly, and there's been some strong regulation around the real estate sector. And I think that is good because I think it gives confidence, it gives transparency, and there's consumer protection, which I think is important. And I think all those things moving in the right direction. So I think, and there's also obviously insolvency and other areas being addressed by government. So I think the government obviously has a responsibility to set the framework, and I think it's moving definitely in the right direction. And I think you're seeing that through the response of the market. So more international investment, clearly consolidation in the development industry, the growth of service providers and professional services. So I think all of that really leading to sort of more maturity in the market and demonstrating strong evolution. So I think the market will drive a lot of it if they have the right framework, and it seems at the moment we're getting a good balance between sort of government regulation plus the market driving the industry forward as well.
So President says it's a good balance. What do you comment on Indian? Do you think it's sufficient, or we need a more reform, particularly in the real estate construction sector?
I think there's, I think without a doubt the frameworks are being put in place. The important thing is that the frameworks go down from the top through every part of India. I think that's where the challenges lie, which is making sure that framework then gets consistently applied. But I think that the one thing for us that still is sort of probably overriding in the importance is you can have standards, you can have frameworks, you can have regulation, but you still need competent people to be able to deliver against those. So, the piece that we keep saying to the marketplace and to government is very important to have the frameworks, really important to have the standards, very important that they go down across all of the parts of India. Remember that the critical thing in all of this is that you need the competent people to apply those standards. Do not lose sight of the fact that actually educating and training and enhancing skills is actually the success of a standards framework. A standard on its own can sit on a shelf. You need competent people to apply it. So for me, education, training and skills along with regulation and standards are a critical combination for the real estate market.
You talk about education basically. This is something also I would like to highlight. And of course, RISC has collaborated with Amity School, the RISC School of Built Environment basically. I think it's something, the gap which you see, still we don't have kind of quality education, skill enhancement, platforms. Especially in this sector. We'd like to talk about more and how this proposition is working and how this is changing the environment basically.
Look, 8 years ago we had 16 chartered surveyors in India, 16. India's a very big country. We now will have, by the time we end this year, for us, our financial year, we'll have nearly 2,000 chartered surveyors in India. We have 1,200 people graduating. We'll have 500 people graduating on Saturday at Amity in Noida. We have 1,000 students, and next year we'll probably add another 600 students. So this is building and growing. So, I'm hoping that, certainly within the next 10 years, we'll have 10,000 chartered surveyors in India, which will really start to change the professional landscape of both construction and real estate. But that's not going to be enough. This is a country that wants, housing for all, 100 smart cities. This is a very bold urbanisation agenda. And therefore, there is a need to find ways to incentivise the transformation of skills. And I think this bit resides with employers. I think employers are going to have to substantially participate in the upskilling of India, the agenda. It can't all be left to education. It can't all be left to the academic sector. And I think that given the vast amount of skill improvement, this is going to require a relationship between the employer, the academia, and a professional body like RICS to help bring greater skill in. So we would see a real need in growth in the earn and learn culture of India. You know, this is where people are coming into work, but the employer is also participating in helping their education whilst in the workplace. That's a way of getting more and more people skilled. And in many parts of the world, what we call the apprenticeship education, you know, taking someone at 18, bringing them in the workplace, providing them equally with skill development and education over a period of time, is a way of getting mass skill growth.
What are the terms of collaboration? How do you ensure the quality in, in the teaching profession, basically? What are the engagement terms with MIT? Do you provide a faculty? Do you provide some technical assistant?
Yeah. Yeah, we help develop the curriculum and the competencies that are consistent globally. So we have a competency framework that we use globally, and we work with Amity to ensure the academic framework can deliver into that, so that the people are learning. All of the people in the program are learning at a level of competence that's consistent with the UK, with China, with the US. So the competency development framework is there. Clearly, we look for academics who have got both academic experience but also industry experience. So we start to just meld the two together, and I think it's really important because education needs to provide people who can work and deliver in the workplace, and this mix between the two is absolutely vital. So all of the programs that we are supporting with Amity are benchmarked to international standards. So all of them get an international accreditation as well as a domestic accreditation.
Your focus is, of course, I see much on education and skill development. It is something to do with education 4.0, which you're talking about. Could you relate? Is it the beginning of your program in India? You want to elaborate on that? You want to diversify on setting up more such collaboration within universities, perhaps across India? Could you talk about more?
Yeah, I can.
Keeping education 4.0.
Yeah, 4.0. Yeah. Look, education is going to transform. There's no doubt about that. I think that in the future, the thought that you will spend 3 years is going to change. Right. So I think if you pick up the point that I made about people coming into the workplace, earning and learning, then actually what you require is a significant digitalised delivery of education. So I think that what we will see, and certainly one of the things that we will be encouraging and working on, is how do you make the education more accessible for a larger number of people? How do you modularise it? How do you enable it to be delivered over maybe a slightly longer period of time, but whilst people are earning? It's quite clear that a number of people in India would not be able to afford to just take 3 to 5 years out to go to university. But actually, if they were earning within the workplace, could they equally be learning at the same time? But that requires a complete transformation of the way we think about education. So in Education 4.0, it's about the personalisation of education using digital technology. That's actually the challenge for the education industry. How do you adapt your education content and delivering in a more bite-sized personal format that doesn't require you to be in the classroom? And we will play a big role in that in order to equip the skills of India.
No, and I think the other role we can play is to work with the employers, as Sean said. I think the employers need to play a very active role in this process, and I think it's been very encouraging this week in a lot of the meetings we've had that they see the need to be more involved in the education process. So I think getting not only their input into the curriculum and participating in the schools, but also, as Sean said, allowing people to join the companies earlier and then assisting with that education and participating directly in facilitating education as part of their employment. I think that's going to be absolutely critical. Yeah.
Our Prime Minister, of course, PM Modi, he has been focusing on a lot of things, especially in the domain of infrastructure, real estate, and so like smart cities, urbanization, and how to manage those elements. Now you see, in the context of India, it's a complex situation. When you talk about the mass urbanization in India, it's very chaotic. You have a complex condition everywhere, and you say you have expertise in this area. When you talk about you have expertise in the mass urbanization, and the kind of value you add to that, what are you talking about in this context?
For us, it's how do you make winning cities? I mean, ultimately, the most successful cities in the world will be cities that are built for people, not buildings. I mean, the buildings are for people, and I think that the thinking that we have through something called our World Built Environment Forum, which is pulling together all of the great thinking around the world to share best practice in urbanisation, is actually let's all understand what makes a city great. A great city is where people feel safe, where people can live, work and play, and they are comfortable for their children to be wandering around that city, that it's delivering what they need to deliver, and that's all dealt with in a sustainable way, which is focused on people's well-being. So I think that the important element of cities, for me, smart cities is a bit of a buzzword. That's about how do you use technology in some way, but the smart is when you understand what you can do to improve people's lives and well-being, because that makes people more productive.
That's right.
So I think that the bit of thinking that we really bring into this is how do you create cities that are great for people, that people really want to live in, that people really want to be productive within, and people and where they want to spend money. That's the trick. So it's the technology isn't an enabler. It's not the end game.
Yeah, and I think it also needs to reflect the growing trend for changing consumer behaviour and changing requirements of new generations around experience in real estate. So it's probably less about some of the physical real estate, as Sean said, and more about experience, productivity, and I think we're seeing that change in the workplace, in the shopping centres, in places of entertainment. So all of that needs to be reflected in urbanisation, and I think clearly our professionals are operating in different environments around the world and can bring some of that expertise to help India as well.
So when Sean talks about the smart city, not in the context of technology, the space for a human being, again, if you see the Indian cities, highly clustered, it's chaotic, clustered, and wiring tangled. When you think in that way, a holistic way of giving definition to smart city, is it possible to implement in India, say a city like Banaras? How do you ensure, how your expertise will bring in and sort of provide value to this, concept?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think clearly you have to adapt the experience and expertise to different environments, and I think India has a unique environment, as do other markets, so I think you need to obviously reflect that. But I think what we are seeing is the evolution in other markets from real estate as a physical asset to real estate as a service. So it's not about so much the physical building, but more about how are you using the space. And I think that can be reflected in India in the way in which cities evolve and how smart cities move forward, because I think, as Sean said, there's an element of technology, but technology is really just the enabler. It really requires the industry to look forward in 5-10 years. How are people going to use real estate? What is going to attract people to community shopping centres or to major destinations of entertainment? How are you going to get people to stay there, spend more money? And it's all really around the experience. But in order to achieve that, you also need to think about the infrastructure, the transport, the accessibility, and how that's all going to work in the Indian context. So I think you probably just need to take a step back and use some of the expertise from other markets and say, okay, this is what's happening, this is what we're seeing, how is that going to be reflected in India, and how best to adapt some of that to the Indian market?
There's some ingredients that you have here, which I think are really unique.
Yeah.
It's about how you assemble them. I mean, you have a very well developed technology sector. You have some very bright thinking in terms of data and property technology. You have a very good service hospitality mindset and sector, and you have a real estate industry. The challenge is, how do you get them all to come together? Because actually the future of real estate is about the real estate, the service, as Chris said, with the hospitality, and deploying technology and data so that you can create a much more personalised understanding of how space can be used.
Yes.
But you have 3 quite significant areas already. I think the challenge for India is, how do you fuse them together? You know, how do we get the technology sector, the hospitality thinking and the real estate sector coming together? And it is starting to happen. And I think once you start to bring that together, that way of thinking about the future starts to shift. I don't think a traditional real estate and construction sector will do this on its own. It requires those other ingredients in order to make it happen.
Indian government, when we talk about, has come up a lot of ambitious plan, regarding providing housing to Indians, all at different levels, basically. Your global expertise, in building in this sphere, how you going to contribute to that? What advice you have for the government, and what technical expertise you want to provide, in this sphere?
Well, look, I think, to be fair to the Indian government, I think every government around the world is struggling with housing. I don't think I've met a government that says we've got all the housing we need. So I think even from a small country, in relative terms to India, like the UK, we have a housing problem. And therefore, if you look at this issue holistically, everyone's trying to cope with the fact that in the early 1900s we had 3 billion people on the planet. By 2050 it'll be 9.5 billion, with 2/3 living in cities. Every single city has a housing problem. The question is, how do you address that? And I'm not sure you address it by continuing in the way you do today. Again, I would say probably every city leader that I've spoken to has not hit their housing target. And I think India is struggling to hit its housing target. The UK is struggling to hit its housing target. Toronto is struggling to hit its housing target. I think what we've got to do is stand back again and say, okay, what do we mean by housing in the future? Do we mean housing in exactly the same way that we've always seen housing? Or can we envisage a different form of housing? And I think that the success of being able to create mass solution is that we see housing in a different way than the way we see it today. So how do we use 3D printed buildings? How do we use off-site manufacturing? How do we use elements of prefabrication? How do we think about housing in a very different way? And I think it's bringing in that sort of innovation that is going to enable us, along with traditional building, to be able to really substantially change the trend. But it's going to require innovation. It's going to require new product development at a rate that the industry hasn't really thought. And the challenge that I think we've got, and McKinsey did a report not so long ago, the global construction industry has barely changed its productivity in 20 years compared to the manufacturing industry that's massively innovated, changed its product and improved productivity. So the question is, how do you change the productivity of the construction industry? And I think you need innovation.
Have you had any sort of engagement with government regarding this?
Yeah, we've even this week we met with the Office of the Prime Minister. We've met with the leader of the New Delhi Council to think about some of these issues of urban challenge and how can we share some of the best practice that we're seeing around the world into what happens. I mean, there is a challenge here, an underlying challenge, which I think we shouldn't escape. And I think it's a really important aspect is how do you create the financing to do all of this stuff, infrastructure, housing. I think, and I could have this wrong, so forgive me, but I think in India about the property tax take in India is about 3%. That's a massive deficit in property taxation. And property tax in other parts of the world is the finance for infrastructure, the finance for affordable and social housing. So I think there is another issue that needs to be addressed in India, which is how do you create a property tax system where more people are participating in paying the tax, because that's how you start to bring in the affordable housing. That's how you start to move infrastructure and so on forward.
No, I agree, Sean. I think from an RSS point of view, the value we can add is around the policy side, which Sean's mentioned, but I think also some of the practical aspects, whether it be the property tax, how to manage sort of after sale service around service charges within residential buildings. You know, that again, there's a lot of best practice around the world to make sure that, again, the consumers are protected, the quality of the product is protected. And I think also in the valuation field as well. I mean, a lot of our professionals are involved in working with banks on mortgage valuations and really making that process as efficient as possible. We have automated valuation models that allow, you know, high volumes of transactions done quickly and valuations. So again, that all results in more transparency and efficiency in the system, and I think again that helps around the housing production, and it helps around the consumer protection side of it and the general sort of maturing of the residential sector. So there's a number of areas there as well.
So based on your global practices and benchmark, you know, when you talk about, you know, across the world, and the challenges you see in India also, you have had discussion with at the highest level with the policy makers in India. You spoke about the one macro challenge, which is the property tax, and then in favor of valuation, you talk about you have maybe the old process, you know, which takes a lot of time. Any major policies advice you'd like to talk about? You know, you see there should be shift that sort of enhances the capability in this sector. Would you like to talk about in terms of, you know,
look, for
policies and macro?
Yeah, no, for me, look, I think really important. I mean, you know, as I said, I think at the heart of all of this still lies education. I mean, all the things that we talked about are great, but you do need the people to run the system. So I think being very focused about the education strategy and to a certain extent, you know, I think one of the challenges that we've faced in India is that actually Indian parents are probably unlikely to encourage their children into the real estate in the construction sectors. You know, and actually there is a massive national need for housing, for infrastructure, for smart cities, but there is a education mismatch between how much parents are really being encouraged to think about the future needs of the country and education. And I'd like to see a bit more of a national need to think about construction and the built environment as a national sort of important task, because I think that if parents don't see a role for their children in the industry, where are you going to get all the people from? You know, otherwise everyone will be in IT, everyone will be doctors or accountants or in the media or marketing, but actually you need a substantial more people in real estate and construction. So there's a bit of a real need of a sort of careers education and encouragement. I think number one. I think continue to do the work that's being done on standards. Every time you think about putting in a standard, and it's the conversation's been having this week, don't be tempted to try and make them a made in India standard. I mean, I do understand that, but the more these can become internationally connected, the more you're going to encourage other people participating in the Indian market, which is going to help improve and enhance the Indian market. If you start to get, as I think you were seeing, Chris, some of the big institutional investors investing in India, it will improve product, it will improve skill. You know, they will do that as well. So the more you can encourage foreign direct investment, yes, I think the more you will also massively enhance the domestic arena. Yes. And I think really important. So keep going with the standards and regulation, but keep relating those to the international world, because that, I think, will drive standards, skills and education at the same time.
Yeah, I think just going back to your original question on the residential sector, I think there's two key things to think about, and this is based on what's being seen elsewhere in the world. One, what is the relevant or relative roles of the public and private sector? Because I think, you know, there's been a lot of different experiments in terms of private sector involvement in affordable housing that's been mixed in terms of outcome. But at the same time, the private sector can play a big role in terms of funding, and some of the institutions are now very interested in getting into residential for lease, so sort of private rentals. So I think looking at what's happening elsewhere and thinking through what's the right model for India around public versus private, I think is very important. And I think also the balance between sales and rental. And again, if you look at what's been happening in markets that have evolved very quickly. I'll take China as an example. Obviously the first phase was all about sales and was very much driven by the private sector. So that's probably fairly similar to India. But now the government is very focused on supplementing that and filling in the residential hierarchy, if you like, with apartments for rent. And now some of the sales of land in China are specifically for rental only. And the interesting thing we've seen is that a lot of global institutional investors are joint venturing with developers to participate in that sector, because clearly it generates long-term returns and good income. So I think those two things are probably the critical things to be thought about. I appreciate the government is probably thinking about both of those, but that for me are the two key ingredients to success of an overall housing policy.
This would be my last question, and of course at the global level, I think one of the few companies, have seen such a vast, astonishingly global presence, almost every country, I can see around, your presence is there. So you have expertise, worldwide, and of course you can match. Knowing that, our first question to you, keeping that in the mind, how do you see the Indian market, different from, say, the market in China? We have the same population, demographic challenges in a space, and also the climate situation you're talking about. And number second, how is your business, growing in India compared to those markets, if you talk about percentage, to Mr. Sean. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to give you a view, and then Chris, I'm sure, will add. Look, I think in terms of how do we see India? I mean, we see it as a great continued investment for our organisation. It's a real priority for us. Outside of the UK, it's where we have the most number of staff. So it gives you some idea of our own commitment. In terms of where do we see it? We see it as a built environment and a real estate industry that's reaching a maturing level. With the advent of the regulations, REITs and so on, we see it at that point of moving to the next level of maturity. And I think that's a really exciting phase, because I think that changes quality, changes standards, changes professionalism and so on. So we very much see it at that point. That's not unusual in the cycle of a very large country with a huge population needing to probably have a strategy that says, we'll just build as much as we can. But then we have a phase where we need to think about what we're building. And that, I think, is not too dissimilar to China, in that, China faced a scenario where it had a big overhang of property, because it was, if we build, they will come. The next version of this is, what are we building? And then how do we make sure that it's right for people? So I think it's at the similar phase of thinking, maybe a slightly different time scale. I think the big difference, and I think this is the starkest difference for me, between, let me pick China and India, because similar size populations. The biggest difference that I found is China had many years ago realised that, given the scale of the population and the amount of urbanisation, it had put in significant amounts of education for its people. So it was probably 15, 20 years advanced in thinking about the need for education in the real estate and built environment world. That was, for me, the biggest contrast, which is, I came to India with a similar population, and that's probably a greater urban challenge, but the education systems for construction, real estate, finance and investment were newer. And that, I suppose, is the bit that I felt, my feeling is China was more advanced in thinking about what it would need to do in terms of the human resource to deal with the challenge. So India's playing a bit of catch up, I think, there in terms of the human resource.
Yeah, no, I think Sean's raised some very good points. I mean, again, I think there are a lot of similarities between other large economies that are going through a similar phase, so whether it's China or Indonesia or others. Clearly the housing is the priority. So there's a lot of similarities around that area. I think India clearly has its own characteristics around legal system, framework, regulation, etc., which is evolving, and I think people need to obviously navigate around that if they're coming in as international investors. And clearly there probably needs to be some more reform over the next few years as to get to where we need to get to in terms of market maturity. But certainly, I think if you're comparing with other markets, it's at a very interesting phase, and I think, as Sean was saying, probably at a phase where we can see that it's hitting various points of maturity, but then there's obviously some ongoing challenges that will need to be addressed, particularly around the execution of the next phase, around the residential sector going forward, and also the ongoing evolution of the commercial sector as well.
That's for the end of the interview. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you very much.
Business World. Thank you, Chris Brook, talking with Business World. The RICS at the heart of change in emerging India. We hope they're going to make the positive contribution to this Indian real estate market. This is Manish Kumar Jha, BW Business World.